Welcome to the workshop. Nope, not the workshop, the demonstration. And what I'm going to demonstrate for you basically is how to intuitively compose. This is different from what we're going to see in the workshop later this afternoon, which is a little more analytical. Intuitive abstract painting is something that I've been doing since I was a child, but I didn't really start to understand what I was doing to be able to actually articulate about it until much later, and I'm still picking up vocabulary. The point about intuitive is that we all do things naturally. Children do not have to be taught to scribble with a crayon. In fact, one of the universal symbols that we see in every culture is the mandala, a circle, which represents, of course, symbolically a face or the source of nourishment, and of course the sun. But the point I'm making here is that there is an innate desire in all of us to make images, which gets squelched through certain types of education. Does everybody understand where we're going here? So what I'm saying to you is that every human has a desire to make images, to convey with pictures. But that is stronger, obviously, in some than others, but it also gets pressed down through an educational system which is universal. This is not just one country or another, it's global. That's been, over the last couple of centuries, developed to produce a certain type of worker. And so a part of our brain, and there's a lot of research now on the bicameral brain. One of my favorite books is Drawing Out of the Right Side of Your Mind, which is by Betty Edwards. If you haven't seen that book or don't already own that, I highly recommend that for your right side of your brain, I'm sorry. And another one, which is by a guy named Pink, is Out of Your Right Mind. And he gives a series of anecdotal stories about folks that have discovered the importance of using the creative aspects of their mechanism. So all that to say, there's two approaches to attacking a surface, to starting a painting. And what I'm going to show you in this first set of demonstrations is what I'm referring to as intuitive. In other words, I'm not thinking exactly about where I'm going until I get there. Does that sound exciting? Mm-hmm. For some folks, it's a little scary. Unfortunately for me, with my set of traits, it's exciting. Because what I'm basically doing, as I said, I've only realized over the last decade or few decades, exactly what this process, or how to communicate this process. What I'm doing when I start out is I'm giving myself a set of problems. And then through classical art education about design and composition, and then once I've given myself that set of problems, gradually solving them one by one using that understanding of line, shape, value, texture, but above all, contrast. Now, the issue of contrast we're going to go into a lot more in terms of developing a composition in this afternoon's workshop, and I'm really excited about getting with everyone who's going to attend that, because we're going to deep dive into the structural elements of a composition. But what I hope to convey to you in this demonstration is some sense of how you can get freer in expression. First of all, and this is extremely important, instead of tweezer dexterity, you need gross motor dexterity. There's not going to be a lot of expression. Now, granted, there can be a lot of emotion, but not a lot of the expressive quality in the paint when you're using your fingers and your wrist that you get when you're using broader strokes that come from the arm, or at least from the elbow. Does everybody understand the concept here so far? I'm looking at you, but I can't see all of you, so I'll just take that as a yes. All right. Point then is that how to start? Well, one way to start is just by making a mark. One of the YouTube instructors that I've been watching and getting a lot of vocabulary in particular from is Pam Kumi, or not, may not be Kumi. I'm not sure exactly how her last name's spelled, but she's on YouTube and she's got a huge following. And her favorite thing is to start out in this process of intuitive composition, making marks. So we're just going to make some marks. And for me, some of those marks are genuinely personal because they relate to the way I use my arm or my hand. And some of them have more to do with what I've done in the past what I've learned from the process of doing this thousands of times. And incidentally, if you get a chance between now and the workshop, please go to the website, which is rgordonart.com. On the website, you're going to see a wide range of styles, techniques, and everything on the website. It's basically a portfolio. And most of the pieces you're going to see were sold either to private collectors or commercial installations. A lot of my work over the last few years has been in collage, and particularly for hospitals and medical facilities. And you'll see that in the website. But the point being, I was classically trained to draw and was a professional illustrator, even a cartoonist for a while. So these were things that developed to the point where when I began to bloom as an abstract painter, though I'd always done it, it came out of building more and more skills. It's the 1,000-hour rule. You have to put in the time, you have to make the mistakes, you have to, and I'm saying have to very purposefully. It's a necessary part of not just building your confidence, but building even the motor skills, the things that go along with being able to accomplish what you want and learning the shortcuts to get there, the tools, handling, all those sorts of things, and particularly the media itself. We're going to talk a lot more about paint, and we can do that at any point during this demo, because that's one of the things that's the trickiest actually when you first start, or if you're just breaking into a certain type of medium. There's a lot to know just about the materials. And some of it you can't get from a brochure. You have to experiment with it. You have to push it around and see how it behaves. Example, some paints are naturally opaque. Some are naturally translucent. If you're trying to do something opaque with a translucent mixture, you're going to be frustrated, and vice versa. So we'll talk a little bit more about paint if you want, but let me show you what I'm going to do with the marks. One of the things that I use commercially, and this started back when I was doing murals back in the 90s, is I use a lot of latex house paint. It may surprise you, but there's a lot of that in museums. Acrylic latex house paint's been developed particularly for one thing, and you're aware of it already, and that is opacity. So when I want to block in something, make it really opaque, I'm going to use the most opaque property material that's available to me. Now you notice even though this is a very opaque paint, it's a little thinner. Can you see the lines coming through? If you can, it's because I mixed some gel with this to thin it out, to make it a little more translucent before. That's what this mixture is. It's a little house paint and a little acrylic gel. And there's two reasons for that. One is I may want it to be transparent, or translucent rather, in some areas. But another reason is because I want it to stay open just a little longer. Latex house paint dries really fast.
Ron, what kind of gel did you use?
This is a Liquitex. That help? All right, so obviously I buy it by the gallon, but for demonstrations and situations like this, I will, one will show up here in a minute. I'll decant it into another type of container. It makes it a little easier to manage. Okay, so this isn't thoroughly dry yet. I'm going to come through, and this is another tool that I want you to see today, and I'll be using a lot of these. This is a silicone tool. Makes it possible. We waited a bit longer than I'd anticipated, so it's not really taking it off too well. We'll do that again with another passage. All right. This is acrylic paint. This is the basics from Liquitex. It's the least expensive. It's a student grade. When I mix it with higher quality mediums, it's going to be as light fast as anything. So don't be afraid of cheap paint. If you mix it with good quality mediums, all of these, and you can see the information on the back or on the brochures that the paint manufacturers put out, all of these are light fast beyond what most of us are going to need. The only time it gets really serious about archival properties in paint is when you're painting for a museum, when your work's being collected for the generations. As a commercial artist, most of my work is only going to be seen for a few years, and it's going to be replaced. Yours too, possibly. This is a squeegee. Just a wonderful tool. Gives me a nice thin application of paint. And I just love my squeegee. But again, when I want to do something a little more opaque, I'm going now, this is a Liquitex Basics. I think this is a cerulean. I'm going to add a little water to it. Give it a little juicier. Okay, so I've already set myself up with a set of problems. I've got a nice sunny yellow and an ochre. But I need now to start working this compositionally. And I'm going to do that with contrast. My selection of color is in part because I know what blue and yellow do together. And because I also know that I'm going to want to introduce a little orange just a little further into this. Everybody hearing me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm not used to working, obviously, without an audience, with lots of breathing and applause and laughter and sighs. So I'll probably ask for feedback more often than is necessary.
We can unmute ourselves, but unfortunately,
No,
we replace you on the screen.
I get it. I'm just lamenting our masquerade.
So what are you? Oh, is that a squeak?
This is another silicone tool.
Ah.
And I use these for two types of application.
Yeah, you can't see what you're doing.
One is to create textures. Another is for those veiled sort of translucent effects. By removing the paint and getting a thinner layer than originally applied. And I'll show you one more example of that. Let's see. A little water. That'll do. Can you see the board now? Looks like it. All right. Now that ochre underneath dried very quickly. So I'm not lifting any of it up. This is going on very smoothly over that already dry surface. Now the beauty of acrylics, and I didn't like acrylics when I first experienced them back in the 60s. I didn't like them at all. They weren't anything like they are now. They've changed radically just over the last few years. I'm going to use the same tool again. This you can get at most of the art stores. I know they have it at Texas Art and also Art Supply. Haven't seen them at Jerry's. I'm using this nib, this side of it, to pull a line. And this side, of course, I get a different. Now, the outcome of this is I am continuing through this process to build layers that later will provide surface tension and interest when I finish the painting. We're going to put this aside for a few minutes to dry. Maybe take a look at it again before we finish today. And we'll pull up another piece that we started earlier. We're coming to you live from First Colony Sugarland today. The studio is downtown in our leaky old warehouse and doesn't have very good Wi-Fi reception. So given all the other technical situations we've endured this morning, I'm glad we're not there because that presented even more challenges. Can I get a thumbs up or a show of hands from folks? How many of you have used acrylics and are familiar with the material, with the medium? All right. You can tell me later whether you like it or not. Okay, remember the yellow I had on my wonderful bathroom squeegee? Our wonderful bathroom squeegee. obviously what I'm playing with right now is a contrast of hue that has to do with complementary colors. You all probably know about the color wheel. These are opposites. One of the interesting things about that is that when you mix them, whether visually or physically, you get a nice tone, especially this particular violet. You're going to get a nice tawny brown that I'm particularly fond of. So that's what happens, and you can see it right there. When these two get together, it doesn't just warm it up. It makes it richer. All right.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's hard to believe he's 17. God, these kids are getting so big.
Barbara, mute yourself.
What I'm doing now is I'm working with the space.
5 cats.
Right, I'm working with the idea of
I thought you meant
positive and negative space to create some shapes here rather than just amorphous sort of random. So these become isolated inside of a form or a shape. They become textural patterns rather than just craziness on a rectangle. That's right. This is more than catharsis. This is fine art.
I don't know how to mute Barbara. I'm sorry.
yeah.
I'm trying to figure it out.
Well, actually, I enjoyed the response. So, silicon tool, I can do some very interesting things. I can cut through this while it's still wet and define shape. And with a little time, these tools get a little more friendly. So now I'm applying enough pressure to just get it light, but not completely as dark as it was. And again, this is about layering. I can go over this dozens of times to get the effect that I ultimately am satisfied with. But again, we're going.
Got it. Sorry.
Feedback. All right, what I'm going to do is add some, yes, that's great, Prussian blue. Still have a little bit of the aqua on the tip of my brush. That's a good thing. I'll use that. Mixing paint is so much fun. Don't you? It's more fun than watching it dry. Where I grew up, that's what we did.
Ron, Eugenia was asking if it was a translucent yellow or an opaque yellow you used originally.
Well, the only opaque yellow that we've used today was an ochre. Ochres, being earth colors, are not transparent. The transparent yellow that I used was probably a cadmium. Now, more and more, the manufacturers, yeah, this is a cadmium yellow medium. More and more, the manufacturers, and Golden's particularly good about this, are manufacturing colors, or hues, I should say, because they're not the original color. The hues, they're manufacturing in the same hue, but not with the same properties that you would find that in nature. So cadmium yellows you can now get. In fact, there's a whole new line. It's called acrylic gouache, which is all matte and all opaque. And you can see where that's going. I mean, that's replacing what I've been doing for years with house paint. So you get the full color value of that hue, but you don't have to deal with the translucent effects that normally come with that particular pigment. Did that make sense? Okay, so that was a cadmium yellow, and they are in the middle range in translucence, but of course I was putting it on really thin. Some yellows are more translucent than others, but generally all yellows are translucent, as are most of your reds, and the reason is because the pigments that are used for manufacturing them are at the molecular level, the particles are so small and they're so separated. So when they're applied, you get this open and a lot of light can come through. All right, this is a much darker value, and I want to do this. Okay, I'm pulling this down to deliberately blend those two together slightly. All right, I'm going to use a large brush to just kind of feather this out where some of this blue starts to be more translucent. Now there's a little water on the end of the brush. Picking up some paint from the top here where it was really heavy, and I'm bringing that across the bottom. Incidentally, for experiments, I'll use like this, which is an experiment. I will use a cutout from Matt, get these from a frame shop, and they save them for me, particularly for when I was holding classes when that started. And I'll prime those with a blockout primer. Some of you may be familiar with kilts. It's really good for blocking out mold and graffiti and those sorts of things. There's a brand of blockout primer that I like even better, which is the Zinsser Bullseye. They have it at Walmart. It's just a little over $20 a gallon. It's still under $30 a gallon. It's a tremendous primer. It will block out the acids and tannins that are in this paper. So I use it on paper, I use it on canvas, I particularly use it on panels because wood panels and masonite panels, those sorts of things have a lot of petrochemicals in the process of forming those. There's a lot of material in there that can leach through even acrylic gesso, excuse me. Consequently, a blockout primer can be far more effective, at least initially. Now, if you want the tooth of a gesso, you can still gesso over that. But over the years, I've had so many experiences with things leaching through the gesso that now I prime specifically with a blockout primer first and then go to the gesso.
What was
If I'm
the
going to
name
use
of
gesso.
that?
Beg pardon?
What was the name of that blockout?
Zinsser, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Bullseye blockout primer. It comes in gray, a middle gray, and also in a titanium white. And if you can just remember the word Zinsser, you can Google that and you'll find it. I believe it's made by a major manufacturer. I'm trying to think of who the actual company is that makes it, but that's one of their distribution lines. Okay, so
At Home Depot and Lowe's also.
absolutely. So you're familiar with the product.
Yes.
Good. Okay. Now, to echo this linear pattern right here, I'm wanting to come back in with some more lines. That's just me. You might want to do something else.
Is that white paint? Or what?
No, this is another silicone tool.
Oh.
And paint doesn't stick to it. Isn't that amazing?
Oh, cool.
Yeah, they wash off very nicely. Not so much the handles, but the nibs are easy to clean. And I'll show you another one of those that's particularly fun. Okay, so while we're on this, let's brighten it up just a little bit. This is the same roller that I primed these with yesterday, these boards, and I still have just enough paint on here to give us a nice little, and incidentally, a roller is a wonderful paint tool. If you're working small, you probably won't recognize the value of it, but it is an incredibly effective tool for reestablishing shapes, obviously for erasing or for blocking in large areas, but you can even get nice little lines. Now what I'm doing is using this white that's already on, just the slightest bit of white left on the roller, to just lighten up some things. You see how that mixed with the aqua? And right there. It's also giving me a little bit of texture. Visual texture, not physical, just visual texture. And as I go, I'm watching as the shapes develop and deciding what I want to leave, what I want to take out, and what I might want to add. Okay, what I just did, I don't know if this is evident or not, but I saw that this line was working for me. I decided I wanted to take it all the way off. I'm going to enhance it now with just a few little strokes like that. Same thing over here, so that it leads off the edge. All right. The one thing that I don't like, keeps bothering me, is this edge right here. This is not working for me. It's too much like a 2x4 sticking out of the block. So I'm going to do something with that area right there. I like the contrast of that, and I like how dark it is, but I don't like the shape. Everybody on board with that? The shape just doesn't seem to be working with all these other organic forms. So I'm going to, it's still wet enough. We'll pull it out, and I may go back in and do something else with that. So that helped. What do you think? This is a good place. This is a good place to start. We can put this aside, go visit it in about a week. We'll see it entirely differently, and that might be the place we finish it, or it might be the place where we tear it up and throw it away. That, of course, is the problem with this, is you're not always guaranteed of success, and that's why sometimes it's a little nerve-wracking. But when it works, it really works, because there's an energy and there's a playfulness about it that carries over to the viewer. And let's do another one. How much longer do I have, by the way? Do I have a gatekeeper who can tell me how much longer I have?
Well, what time, you got started a little after 10:30, so we asked you to demo for an hour, so you got till noon, but that would be over an hour.
Stay with you. I'd love to stay with you all day. I'm good. Just you tell me when to shut up and I'll do it.
You've got 30, 45 minutes.
All right. Well, you tell me when we get to the last 10 minutes and I will finish up. All right, so we're back to this piece. And not as long as you thought it'd be. Certainly not as long as
we were
last time.
talking about you too.
Well, I can still hear you, you know. It's because you can't see me. I have 4 grown children. And I always thought that was fascinating how they thought when they weren't seeing, we didn't know what they were saying.
Oops, you're frozen, Ron.
Beg pardon? I beg pardon?
Oh, maybe it was me that was frozen.
It
Never
was
mind.
you.
I went, whoa.
Okay. All righty then. This is a different brand, but it's also pretty much a student grade. This is the Gallery Winsor Newton product. I forget the name of the fella. Probably shouldn't bring it up since I don't know all the details, but nevertheless, the tube that we use to squirt toothpaste, biofreeze, whatever anytime you use a tube, it was basically invented for paint. One of the few tools that came to us directly. Before this, artists were using syringes to put paint on their palettes. And before that, of course, they were mixing all their paints deliberately and directly in what consisted of a laboratory where they ground the pigment from the original minerals. The introduction of the tube has made all the difference. And the original inventor sold his patent to Winsor Newton. Oh, by the way, all that stuff we heard about Van Gogh wanting to get more paint out of it, so passionate about getting paint on the canvas that he had to squirt it out of the tube. Fact was, that was just a brand new technology, and he was experimenting with that extrusion because it was the first time it had been available to actually squirt the paint out of the tube. I'm sure passion had something to do with it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce, let's do it this way. Yeah. I'm going to introduce, and just put a little water in the paint. It needs to be a little juicier. I'm going to introduce a little white with the idea that we're not there yet, and we need to open up some space so that the composition is a little more refined.
So are you still using your original scribbles with the pencil as your guidelines for?
No. Good question, by the way. No, I'm not. And the point of the scribbles, like everything else in these early stages, is they're going to show up eventually, even if it's just the lightest, faintest sort of ghost underneath everything else. So they matter, but they don't matter. And here's an example. I just put this whitewash over, so it's really downplayed, but it'll be there and continues to be there as sort of a record that adds to the richness of the surface and the surface tension that you'll be able to actually, your eye will be able to feel the tension in the play between all of the different things that are going on. All right, add a little more white to that. Just go Van Gogh style right out of the bucket. I'm doing two things. I'm defining some shapes, making them a little more definite, but I'm also going to leave some of them just ragged and torn. And that's a type of contrast in itself between the hard edges and the soft edges. All right, I want to make that just a little more. All right. This is a comb. Now you see where I'm combing, some of those original pencil lines are going to show more than they did before. If you come back to the workshop, we'll start by finishing one of these, and you can see how all of this texture and layering builds up to a final product. Okay, and I'm going to go back to that Prussian blue that we saw earlier, which is our darkest value for now. Another option that I have, since I'm working on a piece of basically cardboard, and I have used this option even with canvas, and certainly with panels, is I can crop this, frame it up differently to make the composition work by changing the size or even cutting it into two separate paintings, or maybe three. I don't want to
Ron, what kind of surface did you say you were painting on again?
This is mat board. This is the same sort of matting that would go around your prints or watercolors. This is a center cut from a larger mat that I picked up from a frame shop that I work with. And they save these for me. And I typically start using them when I take them and cut them on a large paper cutter for classes. And if we were doing a workshop together today, I would have provided those smaller formats for you to work at your tables. But again, I prime them. I wouldn't use them. If you use them without priming them, the acrylics, in fact, will do a good job of sealing. But the difference is a lot of acrylic is going to go down into the paper instead of sitting on the surface, so you get a whole different effect. It's not a bad effect. It's just one you need to be prepared for and know how that works. And then, of course, if you beat the board like I do and keep going over it with layer on top of layer, eventually the paper is going to wear out. So I prime them.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. The questions are good. They're helpful. And I'm going to go back in. We kind of ran out of time to really get the effect on that because it's so dry. This is the beauty of acrylics. And again, because I do so much commercial work with deadlines, it's possible to do paintings in a matter of days that with oil would take a matter of months. So, and I can do layer on top of layer. It dries in an hour. I can go back over with another layer. As you can see today, this was all laid in just since we've been together. So as it builds, and you'll see on the website, again, I urge you to go there and take a look. You'll see where there are some paintings that have progressed over weeks, not because it took so long to make the applications, but because it took me so long to make the decisions about what I wanted to do once I got to a certain point. I'd try something, go back and forth. And again, that's all recorded in the surface. And you're going to see this sort of editing and adding and subtracting in classical abstract painters like William de Kooning would be a good example, even Debbie Korn. And there's just a host of others that I could mention, but it's a common practice among abstract expressionists to continually edit and make revisions and let a certain amount of that still be left as sort of a notation of this is where we came from to get to here. And since it is so dry, I'm going to try one more. Yeah, it's too dry. All right, so we're going to go over that. I'm mixing that same blue right now with the white to get this blue-gray. And I'm going to make a pass through this because I just don't like the way that's working. It's too much same, everything the same size. So I'm going to change it. Are you getting sort of oh, here's another favorite tool, Mama's mixing bowl. So, this one. Can you see that? Now that, to me, is the excitement of the reveal. That's part of why all this other matters. Is because when I come through, we're getting that darker passage, we're getting bits of the green, some of the pencil is showing, some of where the paint dried, the actual marks of the brush. There's a lot going on there visually that creates a sort of visual appeal that you just don't get with a flat application. That's why we have a drop cloth. We're going to comb that out over here.
Do you prefer something textured for a surface most of the time, or how much texture?
Well, again, that's part of this editing process. Right now, I'm still making layers. So some of the texture is going to get, in fact, I'll demonstrate that right now. Some of the texture is going to get obliterated in the process. These are things that I'm putting as sort of little discoveries that may weave in and out when we get further down the road. So in the starting stage, and in terms of texture, none of this is high level relief. It's very low so that it reads as visual texture rather than physical texture. obviously I've done the physical texture things, you know, the impasto, the heavy buildups of modeling paste. That's great. In fact, I do a series, used to do once a year, of texture tiles that were just all about texture. These, on the other hand, the paintings I feel like are stronger when they don't lean in that direction, and they are strictly about visual effect rather than tactile materials. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Also, I think that when you're using, and this is strictly my personal aesthetic, this is my opinion, but I think when you have a lot of heavy texture and color and line and shape and value, and when all that's going on, there's too much. What's going to happen in this process that I'm describing to you today is at some point, I'm going to start to get really serious about rarefying this down and getting it to essentials, so that the only things really going on will be shape, line, value, and some texture. That makes sense? But again, it's an editing process. All right, now we're coming back with the opaques. And ideally, I'd like to do this with white, but I'm just not getting enough of that from the kit that I have here. So we're going to use this opaque ochre. And again, this is about contrast. What I'm contrasting are the warm against the cool, the textured, busier areas against the quieter areas. Does that make sense? So there's not just a texture of, excuse me, there's not just a contrast of value between darks and lights, but also between textured or busier areas against calmer areas. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm calming some things down by bringing in some of these opaque areas and tones. Actually, I think this needs to be cut off right about here. It's starting to look like a mask. Do you see that? Do you see the eyes? And they're looking through it? No, no. I have a patron who shall not be named, called me recently and told me how much fun a painting that she purchased years ago is one of the stems and leaves series. They were, well, they were stems and leaves. So they're abstractions, though. They're very colorful. And she was telling me how she and her grandchildren got the biggest kick out of looking and seeing all the little things that look like faces, animals, mystical characters, and so forth. And of course, she kept telling me, she said, I know that's not what you painted, but that's what we enjoy finding in there. And actually, that's the gestalt. I mean, that's what happens. You can be in the restroom looking down at the tiles on the floor and you'll see faces. It's just the way we are wired. We're always going to see faces in everything. So even potato chips. It's true. You with me, ladies? The biggest problem I'm having with this today is the no. I'm used to an audience. I really love an audience. I love the, I mean, even if you moan in disgust, I'm enjoying it. So I'm missing you. Some of you look like you smell really good too. No, that's not funny. Yes, it was.
And what color is that?
I'm going to say that that is a decided orange. But we can vote if you'd like.
I like the orange.
Yeah.
So Michelle, we're only seeing you instead of Ron. I don't know why.
Well, and I was seeing Ron and now I see you. I think it depends on how the viewer has their computer, their gallery set up. the view.
I'm going to get so good at this, talking about Zoom, that you're going to ask me back to teach. I'm determined to learn this because it's that challenging, it's that aggravating. Again, I'm going for some quietness here. And also to bring out some of make these shapes work a little better together. Want them to get along. There we go. All right, so what I just did, or tried to do, I'm not quite there yet, is what we call happy family. It may not be as obvious in this, but I'm bringing together smaller shapes in one area, and then I'm going to open this up more around it so that everything it isn't just all the same shapes in different colors or different tones. So I'm working now on rarefying the composition. This is one of the stages. So that means I'm going to take some things out. And we don't use the small brushes much anymore at all, unless it's a portrait or, something that needs delicate work. Just rarely ever do that. Most things can be done with a larger tool, just the way you apply it, like the edge of a brush instead of the full blade. So when I began to realize that not just as a mural painter, but even as an illustrator, that I could do more with larger tools faster, it was a huge breakthrough. Also, when I realized personally, I'm 6'4", when I realized as an illustrator in the 80s that I was miserable because I was working at 8.5 by 11 formats, and I never felt like my work was very strong, typically smudgy, and just wasn't doing a great job as a graphic artist. So when I came back to this as a career in the late 90s, that was the thing that opened it up for me, and the reason I'm still working is because I realized this is who I am. This is how I work. And I mention that in this demo because that's a very important thing. I know I mentioned the difference between energetic work that comes from the shoulder and work that comes from but that doesn't mean that work that comes from tweezer dexterity isn't amazing and wonderful. It's just different. I think what frustrates us as artists so often is that we don't determine first who we are, and that takes a little time. That takes a little falling down and getting back up, but determine what skill sets we've been given by our creator so that we go from there to discover all the potential of that and not be frustrated about the things we can't do. And again, I'm recounting my own history. There were things that I just could not accomplish. I'll give you an example. My wife, Diana, does such an amazing job with small things. With smaller work. We recently did a collaboration together, and when her part came together in this piece, it just, it made my very large abstract work. It really worked together. And that's kind of what I'm looking at in a piece like this. I want some things to be delicate and small, but all of that sits in a field that's a little more rambunctious. Questions so far? Questions so far?
Oh, I agree that Diana's work is superior, yes.
she's had a lot of practice. That girl can flat do the work. Okay,
So the stuff in your workshop today, sorry to interrupt you, is it going to be basically like you're doing today, or?
no.
Okay,
Remember I said at the introduction,
right?
this is just a quick breakout on intuitive composition. What we're going to do in the workshop is much more structured in terms of some ways to strengthen composition using tools that I would call more analytical.
All right.
Does that help?
Yep.
Obviously, you take the two and combine them, and you got a great sandwich. There's meat in the middle there, is what I'm saying.
This is
Okay.
exciting.
Let me do one more thing, and then we'll close out. What time? How are we on time right now?
It's 11:30.
Michelle, is that you?
Yes,
It
that's
is
me.
so good to meet you finally and see your face. I'm going to mix up a nice light blue here. And then go from there. So, I will say this about the workshop. I do tend to make workshops flexible enough to where if, as a group, we have an interest more, and I get a consensus that people don't want to go more in one direction or another, generally that's the way we'll flow. Because the topic of composition is large enough, obviously you could spend months of classes on that. So if there's a direction that as a group I sense that we need to go or want to go more than another, we're going to be flexible on that. But I think I've prepared enough material for you, and particularly a couple of exercises. How many of you are familiar with the ancient Japanese technique of no-tan, or have heard of no-tan? Good. Have you actually done a no-tan exercise before? Okay. We're going to do a no-tan exercise that for a lot of folks in the last workshop that I introduced this, it was a breakthrough. And then, of course, for some other folks, it wasn't. but the point is, it can be. And what's really exciting about no-tan is that if you apply what you learn about positive and negative space, it can become one of the strongest sketching, preliminary thumbnail sort of tools that you can have regardless of the type of art you're producing. I think it's particularly good personally for landscape, and that's the way I frequently use it. In fact, I did a landscape by commission for a hospital in El Paso this year, and what I learned about no-tan came in extremely valuable in laying in my tones and building my values, and I think it'll have the same effect for you as well. All right, so this is an interesting tool. I use it sometimes for mixing, but you see it's long, plastic. I don't think they're silicone, but it washes up real well. This is a Liquitex tool, actually, but it gives a nice sort of dry brush drag, if you want to use it that way, and kind of fun like that. It's also good. It's like a whisk. Works like a whisk. And this has become one of my favorite tools for making textures, and I'll show you that real quick just because it's time to wind up, and I really want you to see that there are so many opportunities for developing what I would refer to as interest using a variety of tools if you're willing to try just about anything.
Where did you get that thing?
Where did I get this thing? This
What
was
is that thing?
It is a bottle washer. It's all yeah. So it goes down the bottle, and that's what I originally bought it for because I wanted to clean out some paint out of some bottles. And there's a piece of me in there. There's a little piece of hair there. Okay, so that's what it's for. It's a scrubbing tool. But when I applied paint with it in a recent project and found out just what a nice comb effect it had, it graduated to a whole different level of need. That is, I need that tool now.
So is that like silicone kind of thing?
Yes, it is. It washes off very nicely, which is a criteria for me, because it's not unusual for me to have to wash, 30 or 40 tools at the end of the day, and or the next day. And so the ability to clean them is really important, unless they're disposable. All right. This is a little lighter tone. I'm going to wrap up with this, see if we can't make this make some sense. I've already determined that I'm going to crop this right about here. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that line at the bottom so you can see it. Somewhere along there is the end of that composition. Now, could I fix that some other way? Yeah, but it's a piece of paper, for heaven's sakes. I mean, let's not get too serious. At some point, I'll cut this anyway to make it fit a frame or a standard size. That's something I learned back in college. If it's at all possible, you want to stay within standard sizes for frames, for mats, for all of that, because it cuts costs. It's easier to manage them, store them, everything. So I really try to, at some point, this will get cut anyway if I decide to keep it to a standard frame size. Does that register with anybody? Because when you go out there and it's in increments of, if it's in increments of other than 2 inches, like 31 by 17, at some point that's an issue of cost or something. Okay, so we've established now that this is the bottom. And so we're going to take that out, come into that. Oops, I like that. That was my fingernail, another one of my favorite tools. And
Try to lean around.
so am I getting there? What do you think?
It's looking good.
Well, you can tell me if you don't like it, because it won't hurt my feelings much. All right, you see what I'm seeing? Some of you are seeing it. It needs to. And it's a little heavy on one side. Apologies for standing in front of you, but that's just the way it is. All right. We're going to pull a couple of lines real quick through this. Finish that line out. No, too late. All right. For those times, and I can't recommend this enough, this is a whole demonstration in itself. This is my favorite brand, by the way. This is Montana. I think it's a German company. These are the small nib markers. They're expensive. They're so worth it. Liquitex makes an excellent set of acrylic markers in larger nibs. Their small nibs don't hold up as well, but they are replaceable. This is what I do instead of small brushwork. Now I'm going to show you that on another board that's dry. This is, instead of using small brushes, especially for this type of work, when I want to do something graphic, I don't use a small brush. I use a small marker. And I want to be careful that I don't ruin my wonderful markers with wet paint, clog them up with wet paint. But I will show you if yeah, there's some dry passages there. I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about, how wonderful these are. And again, they come in much larger nibs. This is a small nib. They're like most markers, they prime just like that. That gets the juice down into the nib. And once they're primed, you get a nice, lean, consistent, brush-looking mark. Now, you're familiar with paint pens, I know, so this is not much different from that. And I'm using this in kind of a playful way to go along with some of the other shapes that we've already established here. But again, especially at this stage where I know that there's going to be another layer after this, this brings in that graphic that we started out with the pencil. So it's layer on top of layer. Some of it's lines, and eventually, you know, as you can see, this is a good example. Lines become repetition when repeated. I can soften these a little bit, take the blunt ends off of them, make them work a little bit more like a brush would. I mean, I'll even sign my work this way. And then, just to make it integrate, after that's dry, I can go over it with a glaze and make it work any hue, with any color or any hue that I want, make that blend right in so the signature doesn't glare out so much. Questions, ladies, please.
Ron, can you tell me again, what was the name of the brand for those small tip nibs you know, the acrylic you were using?
Well, there's several different brands. Yeah, let me give you the full. We'll go ahead and tilt up a little bit here.
I didn't know the brand. I was looking at the box, but I couldn't see.
That box is Montana. Montana.
Like the state?
Yep, Montana. Okay. And ironically, they are made in Germany.
Made in Germany.
Not Montana. There are other brands, though. I use the Liquitex even more because they're cheaper and they're refillable, and the nibs are replaceable. And they come in broader nibs. There are other brands. They even have some good acrylic paint pens, which I've used when I was going to use a lot of them, and I knew they were going to get trashed at Walmart. I'll buy them in the craft section. It just depends on what you're trying to do. You know this about materials. I use gold and acrylics, for instance, when I'm going to do a finished glaze. I don't use them when I'm laying in a mural. So I regulate the quality of, and that sometimes has to do with brand, but the quality of the material based on what I'm doing with it. Since I do a lot of large format painting, that means I'm going to use a lot of student grade paint and a lot of house paint, but usually in the very early development. Unless, of course, I'm sketching. It just depends. And this goes back to school, you know, when we were struggling to even be able to buy bread, much less a tube of paint, and sometimes had to make the decision between which. Yes, everyone has those stories, I know, but that's when I learned about materials and what to do.
Thank you.
It was long-winded, I know. Any other questions, please? I'll try not to be so, whatever that was.
Since I'm an abstract gal, how do you know when the abstract is done? How do you decide?
That's an excellent question. I decide when the problem is solved. And the problem is always about the composition. It's not about how much of this color or does it match the sofa. It's did the problem that and again, this is the intuitive abstracts. If I'm doing, I'm going to be really blunt in my honesty here. I think you guys can handle it. For me, when I really analyze what I'm going to do with an abstract painting before I do it, it ends up being very decorative and it looks very polished and could have just as well have been done digitally or as a print. But when I just charge off into it and sloppily trudge through, at some point I'll come back and those same sort of analytical skills will rarefy it until there's a composition that I feel like is strong. I believe my portfolio shows that in most cases, but you don't get to see in the portfolio or anywhere else the canvases are the boards that got painted over. So the answer to your question is, that's a tough one. And it's a decision you have to make based on an aesthetic that you have learned or borrowed from someone else. And I really want to emphasize that. I know this is a demo and it's turning into a lecture at the end, but honestly, for thousands of years, we learned our craft as artists by copying. Find artists whose work you really like, analyze it, tear it apart, read about it if you have to, get down to how it works. I'm talking about the nitty-gritty of how it works. For instance, I mentioned de Kooning earlier. Did you know that he would mix water with his oils to get some of the textural effects where that resistance between the oil and water would occur on the canvas? That little point in itself explains a lot, but I'm saying when you find an artist whose work you really love, then examine bit by bit how that went together, what layers, what techniques, what tools, all of that, and then begin to emulate it. There is absolutely nothing wrong with copying, and there is nothing new under the sun. What's new is your approach to the technique. You'll do something different with it, which is why I don't have any problem with sharing every technique I've ever learned, every tool I've ever found, because I know you're going to do something different with it, maybe even better than what I've done or will do. Now, I'm done unless you aren't, and I still want questions. Well, I'm glad to see some of the faces are smiling, and I hope you had a little fun. I hope that this was at least intriguing. The big message is get out there and paint, make some mistakes. We are made so that we can learn by daring. Children play. That's the way they learn everything. Play is one of the best ways to learn anything. So get into your studio, your wherever, your hiding place, your backyard, wherever it is that you sling paint, and play. Discovery, creativity is a natural thing.